This outreach program was the piece of the puzzle that put all the other pieces in context and made me understand my birth city after more than 20 years of living there as an adult. As a child, I always wondered why there was so much hostility against me since I lived in West Austin and participated in gifted programs. Most of my classmates had been white, but I thought nothing of that because I had only known living around white people, even in my preschool years, with the exception of one caretaker before I entered preschool at Childcraft, followed by my little sister. Because my parents were fairly successful lawyers at government agencies, we had the childhoods described within the dominant narrative, complete with summer camps and extracurricular activities. However, even as my sister and I were accustomed to living around white people, there was always the sense that we were weird and unwelcome. I managed to graduate elementary school in one spot, but my sister transferred to Barton Hills Elementary when we moved to Barton Hills, but she ended up having to transfer to Matthews Elementary with Carmen Yanez Pulido due to the hostility of her fourth grade teacher. To me, this was normal because my fourth grade teacher had also been hostile to me, and none of this fake nice with mild hostility behavior changed as we both progressed in school. My sister was recruited to the University of Texas at Austin due to strongly worded letters from my School of Law alumni parents, but she still chose to go to Yale, and like me, was used to the hostility, so made a pact not to return to Austin to live. Going back to advocacy, this program was the last program I accepted, and it was only because I felt inspired to talk about the environment after doing my last cycling tour based on environmental degradation. I was working full time, so I was not desperate for the money, but I lived with roommates, did not own a car, and believed in mutual aid, especially after mutual aid was responsible for many of my moves in 2022. The program was supposed to be about 6 months, so I figured I could come up with a project that could be completed in that length of time. Because there was an abominable mayoral candidate who destroyed the historic black community, I figured that I would do some research and provide information about this monster who claimed to be for racial justice but had alienated all of East Austin. I had not truly believed that he would have the audacity to return, but one should never underestimate those with too much confidence and too little impulse control. Throughout all these advocacy contracts, I met various advocates, and their work was more meaningful the more research I did for deciphercity.org. During one of the meetings, the climate ambassadors met with Susana Almanza, one of the founders of Poder, an East Austin organization founded within the Chicano community. It would be impossible to discuss everything they had organized against within the scope of my accounting of advocacy, but suffice it to say that the group had been around for a while and done a number of things. Surprisingly, they had even done surveys to add to the legitimacy of their advocacy against the petroleum tank farms in East Austin, which one could view at the Austin History Center. On a personal note, because my father's side of the family was from Port Arthur, Texas, I had grown up going to my grandmother's house and seeing large petroleum tanks across the creek in her backyard. My two aunts who lived with her died from cancer in their 60s, and I will never forget the smell of refineries between Houston and Port Arthur, trying to hold my breath for the entire distance. These experiences made me particularly interested in this presentation on environmental activism. Unfortunately, as Susanna was going through her presentation, she touched on school integration in Austin and pointed out that a federal lawsuit was filed against Austin Independent School District in 1970, about 15 years after Brown v. Board in 1954. Furthermore, she explained that Austin schools were integrated by court mandate in 1983, which would only be fully implemented beginning with the completion of Keeling Junior High School, my alma mater, in 1986. Susanna talked about many other environmental cases that they organized around, and some of my colleagues found her presentation to be obsolete. Being a native Austinite, all the pieces from my experience as a child to my professional and social realities came together, and I felt a wave of disgust for this despicable city's reputation. I already knew that in the same year of Brown versus Board, there There was another Supreme Court case, Berman versus Parker, which allowed cities to take private property for urban redevelopment, otherwise known as urban renewal. Because of other research, I knew that there were multiple urban renewal plans in Austin in 1968, and the most recent one in 1999 as a result of East Austin being named as the desired development zone in 1997 under the tenure of that odious mayoral candidate. Learning that school integration was 3 years younger than myself, and only because of court mandate, broke what little affection I had for my hometown. Despite my being only 41 years old at the time, my school district had only been fully integrated by the time I finished kindergarten. The truth was that I had grown up in a city of bigots, run by bigots, where the most bigoted and egregious individuals could be successful as long as they claimed to be Democrats. The level of hypocrisy was overwhelming, and that a segregationist was being invited to re-election as mayor after all the districts were established and all these racial conversations just meant that the social climate of Austin would never change. Because I had limited mapping skills and was interested in doing research that did not extract any further from exhausted constituents, I was paired with someone else who claimed to have research interests but was really avoiding further community engagement due to fear of COVID. We had both worked on ATX Walk Bike Roll and attended training, and it was because of them that I found long-term housing based on both of our respect for mutual aid. There were signs that the collaboration would echo previous experiences when I would suggest projects, and there would be meetings with the program director, but no real input from my colleague. However, I was working full-time and trying to complete the research before the terrible mayoral candidate could be reelected, and small esteem I had for myself, I felt that if I could just get that done in time, we could have avoided his reelection. Not only did I not finish the research with very little assistance, either suggested or offered, but I worked myself sick by the end of 2022. I took time off work so that I could do more research, and in hindsight, I realized that working at night full-time, contracting 10 to 20 hours a week, and hoping to catch the recount was not a stellar use of my time. Not only was I exhausted, but through my fatigue, I realized that there was no way that people would be able to read and digest the material before the election. The mayoral candidate's affinity for expanding suburbs and maintaining harmful infrastructure in BIPOC communities would not be addressed in time, and people would be nostalgic about the past when more people had money. I proved to the liaison that work was getting done to confirm that there was a point in choosing me for the project, but something destroyed my immune system just in time for my 42nd birthday at the end of December. In January 2023, I realized that despite all the environmental atrocities of the recent past, I had missed the deadline and I was struggling to come up with a project for the contract. A moment of excitement gave me a potential PowerPoint, which I despise, but could turn into an opportunity for engagement by attending dominant narrative meetings. I crafted a 10 to 20 slide presentation and shared it with my colleague and the supervisor, and when it was time for the meeting, I felt justified in my efforts, only to find out that my colleague had cut off sharing with the supervisor. Waiting for feedback was going to be my leverage into moving forward, and I had been communicating with the supervisor by email to strategize, only being left with this sabotage. I downloaded the presentation, emailed it to the supervisor, and we made plans for a follow-up meeting. The problem with injustice is not just that people are constantly enduring hardship for no reason, but that underworld hierarchies develop that make oppressed people compete against each other. No doubt my colleague got a good laugh at making me look terrible in front of our other colleagues, but they never stopped to consider that they had done nothing to produce for all the time and money we had been given for our project. I was doing my best not to make it look like funds mismanagement, but because it was a chance to take potshots at me, we both looked like incompetent fools and not activists, which is what we were hired to be. Fortunately, our supervisor and I met up, and she suggested the creation of a zine, which was based on another group's project. I thought about it over a weekend, and I finally came up with a draft so that our meeting with the supervisor would be fruitful. During the meeting, our supervisor nudged me to work with my colleague, but since there was unmitigated glee in their efforts to undermine me, I firmly decided otherwise. I was asked to digitize the draft, to which I agreed, and thankfully my father had a scanner for photography, and I both scanned the zine and learned how to manipulate images so that I could do more with the text I already had instead of constantly producing without feedback. After sending the digitized zine to both my colleague and our supervisor suggested events where we could go to get more feedback, meet with teams, which I enthusiastically agreed due to the involving the community. In response, my colleagues smirked and said they had better sources and community members to engage with, and that such events would be unnecessary. By this time, my weakened immune system and fatigue made me vulnerable to COVID-19, despite wearing masks all the time and being as careful as possible. I was also fed up with the rivalry I had never signed up for and anxious for the project to be completed so that I would no longer be in a situation like Decipher City, where I was the only one doing the heavy lifting, but the bullying colleagues still got the credit. While sick, I contacted our supervisor and asked for a meeting in which I made it very clear that I was not being involved with any more competition, and I had done most of the work for this project, but I was done. Our supervisor was very sympathetic after having noticed the undercurrents and excused me from further involvement based on my evidence efforts throughout the process. I understood that I would be paying for the production of the zine, which I could afford thanks to the full-time job, and that there would be a showcase that I would not be required to attend. Later on, after all the bravado, my colleague pretended to recognize how their behavior had sabotaged the project and asked for help again, to which I responded by firmly encouraging them based on the previous bravado. This was the last of all the contracts, and my colleague had depended on social media to take the place of engagement. Not being on social media and seeing how cyberbullying had reduced the number of teens involved, I was not surprised after the COVID-19 lockdowns to see fewer people involved online. Furthermore, I had no knowledge of how my colleague was, except to have heard them mentioning some debates in the past. In the end, our project received the feedback of exactly 3 teens, and my colleague moved my previously produced content around in their digital version. As promised, I paid for the production and continued going to work, preparing to move since our landlord had decided to attack the household as well. The original date of the presentation was moved because of the weather, and I was invited to a different community event that day. On the rescheduled date, one of my old friends had shown up to see me, but I contacted them to meet up later and potentially explain. My colleague tried to shame me about my lack of participation, but I was moving, done with the project, and completely immune to shame from someone who had used my content to save themselves without contributing much for an 8-month stretch. As far as I could tell, this was all a failure. Re-election of a segregationist, project sabotage, and half effort at the last minute. However, the city was more interested in appealing to Tesla for investment and had stopped caring about this contract months before it ended.